idea of suffering in your life. Like it's like a huge cow that needs to be killed. You like sacred cows? Each religion has a sacred cow that they really hold on to, and they won't let it go. Well, I was just thinking about that song where it talks about how he is faithful. And when we often sing about the faithfulness of God, I think we don't really realize what it means when we say he's faithful to us. Like when the Bible talks about that he is faithful, he's extremely committed to making sure you make it to whatever he's got for you. Like he's full on committed. He's more committed for you experiencing the best in your life than you are yourself. Who here has like a really strong desire and dreams to fulfill the fullness of your life? Yeah, I got a few. Some are not, yeah, come on. Yeah, come on. We should all have, but you know what? But God has like a million times more committed for you making it to that than you are. For you to experience the fullness that he has for you. So, hey, I got one more. We're talking about religion, detox, and stuff like that. And I got one more I want to talk about today. And I've kind of talked about how the whole thing about controlling and the sovereignty of God and how it's usually related when talked about when we suffer in life. And then we kind of want to throw the excuse or the blame on God. I just want to share a little bit of my personal experience in facing any trouble and suffering. And I remember so clearly, I was thinking, when we heard the bad news of a family's death, like when we heard that news, you know what the most comforting thing was for me, where it talks about when God would comfort you, is like, I know who my Father is, and therefore it didn't waver where it came from, you know? So, because I have often heard of people like they struggled through the whole process of when they're suffering or the whole process of grieving, during the time of grieving. And another thing is there's no limit in time in grieving. A lot of people think you need to get over it in a day or two or a week and now you need to stop. No, grieving, you can't put a time limit. Everybody handles it differently. It doesn't have to be a certain formula, a different way of grieving. It's okay, all right? That's just to put it out there. I know we as Mennonites often want to just awkwardly stop the whole thing because we don't want to be in the mess, right? But that's not how God intends it. He actually sits with you and grieves with you. He says when he sees you crying, he cries with you. When he sees you laughing, he laughs with you. Like that, he's with you all the way in all of your humanity and all your weaknesses. He's there and to comfort you and to bring you through that journey. But anyway, what I remember so clearly, I was like, man, if I didn't know where this came from, I would be so confused right now. Like if you don't know where the bad things come in life, where they come from, then you're always confused. And then you're always struggling in your grief and knowing where God, trying to find God during your grief. But I remember that during that time, I didn't question or I didn't have a hard time finding who God was or finding my place or finding my footing. My faith wasn't shaken in some what I've heard before, that their faith was really shaken, right? Like their feet were almost knocked off from the foundation because God was shaking their foundation. But when I realized it wasn't God shaking the foundation, that God is my foundation and somebody else is trying to destroy it in my life, then it was easy. I was confident that God's foundation doesn't break. His foundation is solid. He's got enough rebar and concrete in there that it never will crack. It's going to stay. So when I found trouble in my life, I felt safe because I know that the foundation itself wasn't trying to get me off of the foundation. It was something else. This world, the things in this world around us. That's why Jesus says, in this world you will have tribulation, right? But I want to talk about a different kind of. So religion has built a huge doctrine, or is a lot of religion is built on suffering in this world. Like the whole idea of suffering in your life. Like it's like a huge cow that needs to be killed. You like sacred cows? Each religion has a sacred cow that they really hold on to, and they won't let it go no matter what, even if the Bible says it. And they're like, well, how Andrew Womack had that one lady told him that, there's lots of things they didn't believe in the Bible. So they were not willing to let go of the things they were so taught over years and years, even though you could show them from the Bible. They're like, actually, there's a lot of things. We rather want to stick to our sacred cow, right? So we're going to shoot a really big cow, and we're going to have a feast and party and just destroy it, right? All right, I got one that's getting ready. Let's get some good steak out of this dead cow anyway. So I want to start off. There's that verse. This is the whole one. I would say this is like one of the foundations of a religion doctrine. Is this verse right here? When Paul, because when somebody suffers, when somebody tells you a story of their suffering, we often make is we want to relate, so we want to tell our suffering too, right? Sometimes just to shut up and listen to the other person's suffering, and it's okay. Like, not try to do a one-upper kind of thing. Like, I went through this and this, and then the next guy says, well, I went through this and this, because we're really trying to relate. We want to make sure they know we understand, right? So with this story, it happens often is you often quote this scripture when you're going through a hard time. Well, Paul went through this, so I can relate, so I must be in the same spiritual level as Paul because he suffered, so I'm suffering right now, so I'm going to relate. We want to relate in some way, so we try to jump in the same boat. So in 2 Corinthians 12, verse 7, I'm just going to read that verse to start off, and it says, "Unless I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelations, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I be exalted above measure." I don't know how a lot of the doctrines have been pulled out of that one. Like, it's just weird to me, because if you just read that, I can read that one verse, and it just makes sense, right? What's confusing about this verse about suffering? Like, does it make sense? He says, "Lest I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of revelations." So, revelations. Who gives you revelations? That's the first question I want to give you, right? So God gives revelations, right? God gave John on the island a revelation. We have a book of Revelation. But then in our lives, who gives it? Paul. God gave Paul a revelation, right? So it came from God, right? Obviously, it wasn't Satan that gave him a revelation, right? So then it says that a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of who? Of God first God gives a revelation, and now he wants to stop him from having a revelation? Like, want to keep the balance, wants to keep him humble, right? So why would God give you... Okay, so the next question I have, why would God want to humble you through Satan, but yet then isn't that counterproductive for Satan to try to humble you? Because Satan wants you to be prideful. Yeah? Okay, yeah. So it's just by reading that, you just ask some of those questions and just actually think about it, that all the doctrines that have been built around this one verse just start to crumble, right? That cow is starting to starve. Like, it's starting to, like, it's getting deflated. It's not very strong anymore. Okay, well, just hold on. We're loading our gun. Like, I got a big gun coming up that's one of those elephant guns, and we're going to... Okay, I won't be very descriptive. All right, so I thought this was good. Paul says, man, y'all been thinking too hard on this one. He's got a thorn in his finger, and I think Paul's like, man, you guys are making such a big deal of this thorn in my flesh that I was like, wow, whoop-de-doo. Like, get over it. Like, whoo, man. But anyway, we're going to start right from the beginning, because if you want to understand chapter 12 or those verses, you need to start from the beginning of 2 Corinthians, all right? And first off, you need to understand what Paul was going through. So I can really put a lot of things out there, and I think not one of us in this whole country can relate, can even use that verse as a thorn in the flesh compared to Paul. Like, Paul would be, if you would have heard Christians using these verses to justify their suffering, that God's causing them to be humble or in some way, and then Paul would be like, wait a minute, how dare you use my story to relate to yours? Like, man, your suffering's nothing compared to mine. But anyway, first off, so Paul was a missionary, right? So if you go through the book of Acts, he's a missionary. He's making these different journeys. He's preaching the gospel to the Gentiles, right? In Romans 11, we talked about yesterday, he was an apostle to the Gentiles. So he's going to these different places. But where did he come from? He came from Jerusalem, right? So the Jews, this is one of the reasons the Jews hated him. So the Jews really hated him And they did not like that he had switched from the Pharisee side to the Christian side now, right? First he was killing Christians, and now he's making more Christians, right? And so the Jews obviously were like, man, we lost our best guy. We lost our top commander. We lost the guy that was most enthusiastic to help with their agenda, their religious agenda, now had switched sides. And they're like, man, now they were against him. They were so angry, and they were so mad against Paul. So now Paul, not only is he preaching the gospel about Jesus, the gospel of Jesus to the Jews and getting them to believe in Jesus, the one that they had killed, he's now going to the Gentiles and telling them about Jesus and making them saying that they also can benefit from God. So first off, they were mad that the Jews were joining Jesus and saying that they could enter heaven without the law. And now he's going to the Gentiles, which was an even bigger deal, that they could now enter heaven without the law. Right? So now you can just imagine, you just picture that, man. These people were furious. Like, man, this guy is destroying our world. Like, that's why he had a full band of people that followed him on his missionary journey. Like, he had followers. They were not good followers, but he had followers on Instagram, on Facebook, and everywhere, on YouTube, man. Like, he had lots of subscribers that were just, giving him hate mail all the time. But they didn't just send him did it behind a computer. They would physically go follow him and try to disrupt his ministry. Now, anyway, 2 Corinthians 1, verse 7, it says, now our hope for you is unshakable, because we know that just as you share in our sufferings, you will also share in God's comforting strength. So Paul uses these words, and it's pretty interesting. And it says the word share is actually a partner or a companion, right? You guys are suffering, you're sharing our suffering. But also the word suffering is actually not a bad word in a sense, because he says suffering, the word suffering actually means a strong feeling, but it's a result of something, right? And it's a result, and it includes affliction, which should result in knowledge, knowing God's glory, like going through difficulties, persecutions, and faith. So this suffering actually was a strong feeling, a strong emotion from the persecution in their faith. So when you have a strong emotion about something, he was sharing in the sufferings. That's why Jesus says, you will share in my sufferings, right? To the disciples, he says, I suffered and you guys will suffer in my suffering. And Paul saw it as light. And why did they enjoy the suffering? They enjoyed the suffering because it created a greater, stronger motivation. It was counterproductive for the other guy that was persecuting them, right? So if your persecution is in faith, that suffering was a strong feeling. It was like it was like a privilege. It was not like they were discouraged in a sense. And then the word comfort is to intimate call, encouragement, holy urging from the Lord, directly motivating and inspiring. So the comforting as a result from the persecution, the comforting, he's like, but you guys will be comforted. So if you get persecuted, you'll get comforted. You'll have a personal, direct comfort and inspiration from the Lord. Like he says, so he's trying to encourage the believers that don't be worried when you get persecuted, because a lot of people, they would run away. So if you read through Paul's letters and his stories in Acts, it was always when he was talking about that he was in prison, he says, he was kind of encouraging him and say, don't be afraid of what I'm going through, because people were ashamed of him. He was in prison, and then he said yet that some they're ashamed of me because I'm in prison, so they've left me, because they didn't think his ministry was not valid anymore. Because if you go through the book of Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, there is a certain kind of group of people, they call them the super apostles, They were the super apostles because they looked so good. They would lift themselves up so much, and they were all about the outside looks and how everything was working good. The Pharisees were like that too. Sadducees, they were all about having the high seats, the right clothing, the right prayers in public. But when there was persecution against them, they were gone. Right? So it was all about the outward appearance, and it was all just dead man's bones on the inside. Right? So Paul was trying to tell them that through this whole book, you'll realize that Paul was trying to tell them, just because I'm being persecuted doesn't mean what I'm doing is wrong or that it's not valid, that his ministry was not valid. Because a lot of times when we see, even in this time, when somebody does something and then everybody is against them, they're like, oh, that must not be valid because it's not really doing anything. It's not, you're like, oh, he's, and that's, especially in the media, it seems like even in the world, they're so afraid of being wrongfully accused or being persecuted because they'll be canceled. Paul was being canceled everywhere he went. He was going against the grind. He was going against the flow. He was always going against things that were going on. So to the Jews, he was preaching against the law. He was like, man, you can't enter the kingdom through the law. It's through grace. He would go to the Gentiles, and then he was going against them because they were living an immoral, messed up life, bringing worship to different idols. And he says, no, Jesus is the only way. You need righteousness, and you need righteousness only through Jesus. So everywhere he went, it was going against people, right? And he was being canceled. But Jesus says in Matthew 24:9, you can expect to be persecuted, even killed, for you will be hated by all the nations because of your love for me. Right? Okay, so I'm building a trend here, if you're realizing, and through the whole book of Corinthians, we'll see. So, second Corinthians, it's not second four, Corinthians. Anyway, for we do not want you to be ignorant, brethren, of our trouble which came to us in Asia, that we were burdened beyond measure, above strength, so that we despaired even of life. Yes, we had the sentence of death in ourselves, that we should not trust in ourselves, but in God who raises the dead. Right? So he's right away in chapter 1, he explains already how much they've suffered. He says, we had so much pressure, like there was so much, we were burdened beyond measure, above strength. Like he says, it seemed an impossible task. So if we keep going, in verse 9, a lot of people, they have this whole thing where they mess up, like, oh God, because in the verse before that, you see at the bottom in verse 9, it says, we had the sentence of death in ourselves, that we should not trust in ourselves, but in God who raises the dead. So often people will take that verse like that. Okay, God caused me trouble, so I would be forced to trust him. Does that sound familiar? I am suffering because I am now forced to trust God. I don't know if you can be forced to trust someone. You can't. No, you can't be forced to trust someone. So if you think that God is bringing all these troubles so that you're being backed into a corner, and then all of a sudden you're like, okay, I give up. I guess I'll trust you. Trust is built on what? Faith comes with what? Faith works in what? Trust and faith, same thing. It works in love. Love is what causes people to trust you, right? If I come to you and I beat you up, are you going to trust me? I come to you next time and I just go like this, you're going to be like, that's not a level of trust that anybody wants, right? So God gains your trust by being good to you. That's what he did from the beginning. Right from the beginning, he created everything for the Israelites through the desert. He trying to gain their trust because he delivered them out of Egypt, and he says, and he told them, build an altar here so you will remember that you can trust me. I delivered you this time, and I'll deliver you again, and I'll deliver you again. I'll help you again. Even if you guys turn your back on me, I'll deliver you again. I'll save you again. It was over and over. God was using his love for the people to gain their trust, right? He didn't force them. You can't force trust on people, all right? Anyway, God was in a way earning his trust for you. A lot of times we think we have to serve God. God is waiting. We have to earn God's trust for us. But actually, the new covenant is that he's trying to convince us that we can trust him. Right? Because the other way, it's all based on you. Right? So when you learn to trust him, the result is he can trust you. Because he sees that you trust him. Because then you understand his nature. When you begin to trust him, you know his nature. It's him first and then you. We respond. He's not waiting for you to get you to prove that he can trust you. Right? Anyway, so this is how it often gets twisted. So back to verse 9, it says, it felt like we had a death sentence written upon our hearts, and we still feel to this day it has taught us to lose all faith in ourselves and to place all of our trust in the God who raises the dead. different translations. He says, it has taught us, these things around us has taught us that, wow, I can't do this on my own. I'm going to trust my God because my God's good. These things are all trying to destroy me. I can trust that. It in a way, it has taught me to trust God. It's not that God was causing me to trust him. It taught me that I can trust him because you already know him before you entered the storm, right? Before you faced the trouble, you knew who he was, and then you face something and like, wow, this just obviously showed me that I can't do this on my own, like in the first place, right? It just exposes when they face trouble and pressure, it just exposes who you already trust, right? So, and 2 Corinthians 4, he goes on. It's just through the whole book, there's a theme that he talks about. It's in verse 7, chapter 4. It says, but we have this treasure in earthen vessels. Another translation talks about that we're just mere clay pots. Fragile. Clay pots are fragile. You drop them, boom, broken, right? But it says, we're earthen vessels, that the exceeding greatness of the power may be of God and not from ourselves. We are pressed on every side, yet not straitened. Perplexed, yet not under despair, pursued, yet not forsaken, smitten down, yet not destroyed. We are this fragile clay pot, but we have so much on the inside. Like, okay, how do you keep a pot from breaking? Put pressure on the outside. You put pressure on the inside. It can't collapse on itself if it's full, right? There's so much force on the inside of him, he says, I'm being beat up from every side. I'm getting pushed from every side. But I'm not collapsing. I'm not giving in because the force inside of me is stronger than the force that's on. That's why it says, greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world. So there's two. So there's the one in you and the one in the world that are fighting. And it's not you fighting with yourself or fighting the world. It says, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but we fight against principalities, against dark. There's things in the world that are trying to stop you, right? And that's what Paul was experiencing. Everywhere I'm being pushed. For all things are for your sakes, that grace having spread through the many may cause thanksgiving to abound to the glory of God. Verse 15 on chapter 4. And he says, all these things I'm willing to endure because it's for your good. Because it's for your sake that I'm doing it. He's suffering and he's being persecuted for your sake so that people would hear the grace of God. He would keep preaching no matter how many times they would beat him up. You know, the disciples right from the beginning when they started preaching, they arrested him, they whipped him, and then they let him go. And he said, stop preaching in the name of Jesus. And Paul is doing the same thing. They would beat him, and he says he would go, and he says, I'm going to keep doing it because it's for your good. He was excited for other people to be able to experience the grace of God. Okay, chapter 6, verse 5, it says, we've been beaten many times, imprisoned, and found ourselves in the midst of riots. We have endured many troubles, have sleepless nights, and gone hungry. He was left for hunger. Like it talks about, it says we were fasting, but actually the word fasting, there's actually they didn't have food. He wasn't voluntarily fasting. He just didn't have anything. Paul said at one point, he says, I've learned to have a lot and I've learned to have nothing. Like I've learned to live in both worlds content, be happy, because he said, God is my source and he is my foundation, not my circumstances around me, right? But he says that he says we've been found ourselves in the middle of riots. Like people would create riots in his meetings. He would have like a meeting like this. He would have a ton of people everywhere. There was healings and people were coming, and then all of a sudden there was a big riot because somebody would start yelling a word. Anybody ever seen that where there's a bunch of people and somebody just has to say something to scare people and they start running and freaking out? That's what they were doing to Paul. Everywhere he went, they would create riots to go against him because they would give misinformation. We'll see that later. And in chapter 6, verse 8 and 9, it says, amid honor or dishonor, slander or praise, even when we are treated as deceivers and impostors. They were treated as deceivers. People were telling him, Paul's a deceiver. He's an imposter. He's a fake, right? It says, we remain steadfast and true. We are unknown nobodies whom everyone knows. We are frequently at death's door, yet here we are, still alive. We have been severely punished, yet not executed. He says, I've been punished, I've been beat up, I've almost been killed many times, but I'm not executed, like I'm not done yet. Right? He kept going. And then if you just connect that with the prophecy that was given him, it says there was actually, the Spirit gave him a revelation that he would end up in chains, prison, and he would be killed. Paul knew this all along. He had a revelation that the Spirit showed him. He says, this is where, if you continue on this path, this is where you'll end up. So God is almost like, hey, if you're going to go down this road, this is what it's going to look like. And Paul's like, I'll do it. He purposely stepped into that path. Hey, thanks for tuning in. That is the end of part 1 of that message on Paul's thorn in the flesh. And part 2 will be coming up because our video camera battery died in the middle of that service. So I will be recording it again, the second part of it, but it'll be coming up. So thanks for tuning in, listening up. So wait up for the part 2 of Paul's thorn in the flesh and all those things that go with that, and all the sacred cow that we're trying to kill. But anyway, bless you. Thank you for support. And if you want to know more information, just tune in on Facebook at Impact Eon, on Facebook, on Instagram, and on YouTube. So we'll see you next time. Thank you.